The train whistle screamed a sound of progress to some, but for the woman huddled in the dusty corner of the cattle car, it was the shriek of a closing cage. Her name was Josephine O'Connell, and her future was a gilded prison forged by her father's debt and a powerful man's pride. But as the Sierra Nevada mountains clawed at the sky outside a different future, a desperate one took root in her heart. With nothing but a pearl-encrusted wedding dress and a sliver of hope, she was about to trade a life of certain misery for a terrifying unknown. Her first step would be a leap of faith, a fall from a moving train into the heart of a wilderness that was just as broken and just as unforgiving as the man she was fated to meet. The air in the O'Connell mansion in San Francisco was thick with the scent of lilies and impending doom. It was August 10th, 1885, the day Josephine O'Connell was to be wed. From her window she watched the fog roll in from the bay, a grey shroud for a day that was supposed to be bright. Her dress a monstrosity of French lace, and seed pearls felt less like a garment and more like a suit of armor she was being forced to wear into a battle she had already lost. It was heavy constricting and worth more than her father's saloon had made in a year. Her father, Patrick O'Connell, a man whose ambition had always outpaced his luck, stood by the door. His face, usually ruddy with cheer, and whiskey, was pale and drawn. He wouldn't meet her eyes. He couldn't. "Josie, my girl," he began, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Bartholomew Duke is a powerful man. He'll give you a good life, a secure life." "He is a cold man, father," Josephine replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. She turned from the window to face him. "He looks at me as he looks at one of his properties, something to be acquired, something to own. Bartholomew Duke." The name left a bitter taste. He was a land and railroad baron who had carved a swath of power from Sacramento to the Nevada border. He was twice her age, with eyes like chips of granite and a smile that never reached them. He had bailed her father out of a disastrous gambling debt, and Josephine was the final payment on the ledger. Her father had sold his only daughter. "Security is what matters in this world," Patrick mumbled, fidgeting with his cuffs. "Love is a luxury for poets and paupers." "Then I would rather be a pauper," she said, a spark of the defiance she thought had been extinguished flaring in her chest. He had no answer for that. He simply sighed a sound of utter defeat and left her alone with the lilies and the lace. The ceremony was to be at Grace Cathedral, a monument to a god who seemed to have turned a blind eye to her plight. As the carriage rolled through the bustling streets, Josephine saw the faces of ordinary people, merchants, haggling children, laughing, women chatting over laundry baskets. They were free. The thought was a dagger in her heart. She made her decision in the space of a single panicked heartbeat. As the carriage slowed to navigate the crowded thoroughfare near the rail yards, she saw her chance. The Transcontinental Railroad station was a hive of activity. A train belching steam and smoke was preparing to head east into the unknown, east away from Bartholomew Duke. "Stop the carriage." She feigned a sudden illness, clutching her stomach. "I feel faint. The corset, it's too tight." The driver, concerned about delivering damaged goods, pulled the horses to a halt. As her father's hired companion, a stern woman named Mrs. Gable, fumbled for smelling salts, Josephine acted. She threw open the door, her voluminous dress be damned, and ran. Shouts erupted behind her. The weight of the dress was a nightmare, catching on crates and slowing her down. Pearls tore from the bodice, scattering on the grimy street like discarded teeth. She ignored the stares, the gasps, the pointing fingers of a bride running wild through the city. Her only focus was the train. She scrambled into an open cattle car, just as the final whistle blew and the massive machine lurched forward. Hiding behind a wall of hay bales, she pressed herself into the rough-hewn wood, the smell of manure and sweat filling her lungs. It was the sweetest scent she had ever known. It smelled of freedom. As the train picked up speed, she peered through a crack in the slats and saw the frantic, furious face of Bartholomew Duke on the platform, his mouth forming a silent roar of fury. Her father stood beside him, a portrait of pathetic ruin. She had escaped, but as the familiar skyline of San Francisco shrank into the distance, replaced by rolling hills, and then the formidable shadow of the mountains, a new fear began to creep in. She had no money, no food, no water, and was wearing a wedding dress that was now little more than a tattered, dirty flag of her rebellion. She had run from the cage, yes, but she had run straight into the wilderness. For a day and a night the train rattled on. The summer heat in the enclosed car was suffocating. Thirst became a physical torment. Her tongue was a dry, swollen thing in her mouth. She knew she couldn't stay on the train. Duke would have men watching every stop from here to Omaha. She had to get off somewhere remote, somewhere unexpected. As the train began its slow, arduous climb into the high desert plains of the Sierra Nevada, she made another desperate choice. Waiting for a moment when the train slowed on a steep grade, she pushed open the heavy door and leaped. She landed hard, tumbling down a rocky embankment, the remnants of her dress shredding against sagebrush and stone. The world spun in a dizzying kaleidoscope of blue sky and brown earth before settling into a throbbing, painful reality. The train chugged on, disappearing around a bend, its whistle a final, lonely farewell. Silence descended. It was a profound and absolute silence, broken only by the buzz of insects and the whisper of a hot wind. She was alone, truly, utterly alone. She pushed herself up her body, a canvas of scrapes and bruises. In every direction, there was nothing but endless sun-scorched earth, dotted with hardy brush and skeletal-looking junipers. The sun was a merciless hammer in the sky. She started walking with no destination in mind other than away. Hours bled into one another. The thirst became an all-consuming fire in her throat. Her vision blurred the landscape, wavering in the heat. The fine leather shoes she'd been married in were shredded, her feet raw and bleeding. She thought of water, a cool, clear stream, a deep well. The memory of a simple glass of water was an exquisite torture. By what she guessed was the second day, she was staggering her mind, a fog of delirium. She saw mirages of shimmering lakes that vanished as she stumbled towards them. She collapsed, crawled, and collapsed again. Finally, her body could give no more. She lay beneath the meager shade of a sun-bleached rock, her breath coming in shallow rasps. The world was fading to black at the edges. She thought of her father's weakness, of Duke's cold fury, and of the foolish girl who thought she could outrun her fate. Perhaps this was it. Perhaps the wilderness was just a different kind of cage, one with a swifter, harsher sentence. Her last coherent thought was not of fear, but of regret. Regret for a life she never got to live. Then there was only darkness. Wyatt Cole moved with the quiet economy of a man long accustomed to his own company. His world was circumscribed by the fences of his Whispering Creek Ranch, a spread of land nestled in a high valley that was just remote enough to discourage casual visitors. His days followed a rhythm set by the sun, and the needs of his small herd of cattle: mend the fence, check the water levels, ride the perimeter. It was a simple life, a Spartan one, and it was exactly the buffer he needed against a world that had once taken everything from him. His face was a testament to the harsh sun and a harsher past. It was weathered with lines etched around his eyes and mouth that weren't from laughter. His eyes, a pale, clear blue, held a permanent watchfulness, the look of a man who expects the worst and is seldom surprised when it arrives. He was riding his buckskin Dusty along the southern edge of his property, where the land gave way to a desolate stretch of alkali flats and rocky outcrops, when the horse suddenly shied. "Easy, boy," Wyatt murmured, his hand instantly going to the Winchester rifle scabbarded at his side. He scanned the terrain, his eyes missing nothing. He wasn't looking for cattle rustlers, they rarely bothered with a herd as small as his, but for mountain lions or rattlesnakes. Then he saw it. A flash of white against the dun-colored earth, huddled near a cluster of rocks. It was unnatural, out of place. He dismounted, pulling the rifle from its sheath, and approached with caution. As he drew closer, the shape resolved itself. It was a woman, or what was left of one. She was dressed in the tattered remains of what looked impossibly like a wedding gown. The fabric was torn and stained with dirt, and what looked like blood. Her face was turned away from him, her hair a matted tangle of auburn and dust. She was frighteningly still. He nudged her shoulder gently with the toe of his boot. Nothing. He knelt, pressing two calloused fingers against the side of her neck. He felt it. A pulse. Faint, thready, but there. Wyatt swore under his breath. This was a complication he didn't need. His first instinct, the one honed by years of solitude and loss, was to ride on. Bringing trouble home was how trouble started. But then he saw her face, partially obscured by her hair. She was young, and the cracked, sunburnt lips, the hollows beneath her cheekbones, spoke of a desperation he understood on a visceral level. He had known that kind of thirst for life when his own had been drained away. With a heavy sigh that seemed to pull up years of resignation from his soul, he made his choice. He couldn't leave her to the coyotes and the vultures. Whatever damn fool thing she had done to end up here, she didn't deserve to die for it. Gently, he gathered her into his arms. She weighed next to nothing, a bundle of bones and ruined finery. He managed to get her draped over the front of his saddle, her head lolling against his thigh. He swung himself up behind her and turned Dusty toward home, the slow, plodding gait a concession to his fragile cargo. The ranch house wasn't much to look at. A sturdy one-room cabin he'd built himself from pine logs with a stone chimney and a wide porch. It was functional, clean, and profoundly empty. Inside, the sparse furnishings spoke of his solitary existence: a bed in one corner, a table with two chairs, one of which was never used, a cast-iron stove, and a single bookshelf holding a half-dozen worn volumes. On a small hand-carved mantelpiece, above the cold fireplace, sat a single heartbreaking object, a small wooden horse, its paint faded and chipped. He laid the woman on his bed, the only soft surface in the house. He worked with a gentle efficiency, cutting away the ruined remnants of her dress. He cleaned her cuts and scrapes with carbolic soap and water, his touch surprisingly deft. He saw the raw blisters on her feet and the angry sunburn across her skin. Using a clean rag, he dribbled water onto her lips, a few drops at a time. She moaned a low, unconscious sound, and her lips parted, seeking the moisture. For 2 days she drifted in and out of a fevered haze. Wyatt sat by the bed when he could, forcing water, and then a thin broth between her lips. In her delirium, she spoke fragments of sentences. "Duke, no. Father, why? The train." The words meant nothing to him, but they painted a picture of flight and fear. On the 3rd morning, he was sitting at the table cleaning his rifle when he heard a rustle from the bed. He looked over. She was awake, her eyes the color of moss after a rain were open and fixed on him. There was no delirium in them now, only a sharp, cornered animal fear. "Where am I?" She whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "Whispering Creek Ranch." He answered, his voice rough from disuse. He didn't move from his chair, giving her space. "Found you out on the flats. You were near dead from thirst." She tried to sit up, a flicker of panic in her eyes, as she realized she was wearing one of his oversized shirts. She clutched the rough fabric to her neck. "Who are you?" "Wyatt Cole." She absorbed this, her gaze darting around the Spartan cabin, taking in the rifle in his hands, the stark emptiness of the room. Her eyes lingered on the wooden horse on the mantel. "What do you want?" The question was sharp, accusatory. He couldn't blame her. He set the rifle down on the table, a deliberate, non-threatening motion. "Right now I want you to drink this." He gestured to a cup of water on the bedside table. "You're weak as a newborn colt. After that, I want to know what trouble you're running from, because you sure as hell brought it to my doorstep." Josephine stared at him. He was not a soft man. His face was hard, his eyes guarded. But he hadn't hurt her. He had saved her. She was torn between gratitude and suspicion. In her world, men like this didn't exist, men who lived apart, who asked for nothing. Men from whom you couldn't immediately discern a motive. Bartholomew Duke's motives were clear as glass. This man, Wyatt Cole, was a mystery. "My name is Josephine." She said, her voice a little stronger. She reached for the water, her hands shaking so badly he stood up and held the cup for her. She drank deeply, the cool liquid a balm to her ravaged throat. When she finished, she leaned back against the pillows, exhausted by the small effort. "Josephine." Wyatt repeated the name, sounding foreign in the quiet cabin. "Now tell me about Duke." The days that followed were a quiet, careful dance of proximity and distance. Josephine, or Josie, as she hesitantly told him she was sometimes called, recovered her strength slowly. Wyatt, for his part, maintained his gruff, solitary routine, yet she noticed small changes. He started making enough coffee for 2 in the mornings. He'd leave a plate of food on the table for her before he went out, never staying to watch her eat. Josie was not accustomed to idleness. As soon as she could stand without the world tilting, she began to make herself useful. She swept the cabin floor, washed their few dishes, and mended the shirt she was wearing with a needle and thread she found in a small tin box. She saw the way Wyatt looked at her efforts, a flicker of surprise, maybe something else. He quickly masked. One afternoon, she found a patch of stubborn, resilient vegetables growing behind the cabin squash beans and potatoes. They were meticulously tended. It was another crack in the facade of the hardened loner. A man who tends a garden cares about putting down roots. "You should have left me," she said one evening, as they sat at the table in a silence that was becoming less awkward and more companionable. The sun was setting, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. Wyatt looked up from the piece of leather he was tooling. "Thought about it," he said, his voice flat. "Why didn't you—" He set his tools down and looked at her, his blue eyes holding a depth she hadn't seen before. "Because nobody deserves to die of thirst in the dirt, no matter what they've done." He paused, his gaze shifting to the fireplace. "And because I know what it is to have everything taken from you." It was the most he had ever offered about himself, an invitation of a sort. "I was running away," she confessed, the words tumbling out now that the dam had been broken. "From a marriage, to a man named Bartholomew Duke. My father, he owed him a great deal of money. I was the collateral." Wyatt's hands stilled. He knew the name. Everyone in the territory knew of Duke, knew of his ruthlessness, his bottomless ambition. "Duke's not the kind of man who takes kindly to being slighted. He'll have men looking for you. "I know," she whispered. "I thought if I could just disappear." "There's no such thing as disappearing," he said, his voice laced with a bitterness that was clearly personal. "The past always finds you." A few days later, while Wyatt was out checking a line of traps, Josie's curiosity finally got the better of her. She picked up the small wooden horse from the mantel. It was crudely carved, but with an unmistakable love. The corners were worn smooth, as if from being held by a small hand. As she turned it over, she saw faint initials burned into the underside TC. She was still holding it when Wyatt returned. He stopped dead in the doorway, his face instantly hardening into a mask of stone. The air in the cabin grew cold. "Put that down," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. Josie flinched as if struck. She immediately placed the horse back on the mantel, her heart pounding. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to." "Don't touch my son's things." He bit out, striding past her to the stove, his back a rigid wall. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. "My son's things." Present tense. But the emptiness of the cabin, the single set of footprints around the yard, the profound loneliness that clung to Wyatt like a shroud, it all screamed of loss. She stood frozen for a long moment before finding her voice. "What was his name?" she asked softly. Wyatt didn't turn around. His shoulders were slumped. "Tim," he finally said, his voice choked. His name was Tim, and his mother was Sarah. "What happened to them?" Josie pressed, knowing she was treading on sacred, hallowed ground. He finally turned, and the raw grief in his eyes was so powerful, it made her ache. "Diphtheria, 5 years ago. Took them both inside of a week. The doctor was a day's ride away, and by the time he got here..." He trailed off, shaking his head, unable to finish the sentence. "I built this place for them. For us. After they were gone, I just stayed. There was nowhere else to go. Here it was, the broken past, not a story, but a gaping wound that had never healed. She saw now that his solitude wasn't a choice born of misanthropy, but a self-imposed quarantine against further pain. "I'm so sorry, Wyatt," she said, her voice filled with a genuine sorrow that reached across the space between them. He just nodded, unable to speak, and walked out of the cabin, leaving her alone with the ghosts of the family he had lost. From that day on, something shifted. The wall between them, already crumbling, was now all but gone. He started talking more, telling her about his land, the habits of the animals, the signs of a coming storm. She in turn told him about her life in San Francisco, a life that now felt like it belonged to someone else. She proved to be a quick learner and a hard worker. She helped him round up a few stray cattle, her torn wedding dress, long since replaced by a pair of his old trousers and a durable shirt. She learned to shoot the small pistol he kept in the cabin, her initial fear of the weapon replaced by a grim sense of competence. She was no longer just a refugee. She was a resident, a partner of sorts in this quiet, isolated life. One evening, as she was mending the hem of her original dress, which she had kept folded in a box, her fingers felt something stiff and unfamiliar, sewn into the lining. It was a small, flat packet wrapped in oilcloth. Her heart quickened. Her father had been with her just before she left for the church. He'd hugged her tightly, whispering, "Forgive me, Josie. This is the only way." She'd thought he meant the marriage. With trembling hands, she carefully unstitched the seam. Inside the oilcloth was a folded document, an official-looking deed with seals and signatures. She unfolded it. It was a property deed, old and brittle, for a 100-acre plot of land, designated as the Silver Creek Claim. The original claimant was a man named Eamon O'Connell, her grandfather. The land, according to the surveyor's map, was located deep in the high desert, right where Bartholomew Duke was currently blasting a new line for his railroad. She showed it to Wyatt. He took the document, his brow furrowed in concentration as he read it under the lamplight. Silver Creek, he murmured, tracing the map with his finger. I know this area. People say it's barren, worthless. But Old Man Hemlock, the prospector who used to live in these parts, always swore there was a rich silver lode there. No one ever believed him. He looked from the deed to Josie, his eyes wide with a startling realization. Josie, he said, his voice low and urgent. This isn't about your father's gambling debt. Not entirely. Duke doesn't want you. He wants this deed. The marriage, it was the easiest way to legally absorb your family's assets, including any old claims they might hold. He wants that silver, and your father knew it. This wasn't a settlement. It was a heist. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Her father hadn't just sold her. He had tried, in his own weak and desperate way, to give her a fighting chance. He had armed her with the one thing Duke truly wanted, but the revelation was terrifying. She wasn't just a runaway bride who had embarrassed a powerful man. She was the sole obstacle between that man and a potential fortune. And he had no idea she was holding the key. Wyatt folded the deed carefully. He won't stop looking for you, he said, his voice grim. And now I know why. He won't ever stop. The town of Redemption Peak was little more than a single dusty street carved out of the vast, indifferent landscape. It had a general store, a saloon, a blacksmith, and a sheriff's office. It was a way station, a place people passed through on their way to somewhere else. For most of its residents, it was the only world they knew. Sheriff Brody was one of those residents, a man in his late 50s with a drooping mustache and eyes that had seen too much foolishness to be easily impressed. He valued peace above all else. His job was mostly settling disputes over stray cattle and convincing drunk cowboys to sleep it off in a cell rather than in the street. So when the two strangers rode into town, he took notice. They weren't cowboys. They were dressed in dark city-style clothes, ill-suited for the heat, their faces pale under the brims of their hats. They rode expensive horses and carried themselves with the coiled stillness of men who were paid to be dangerous. They checked into the boarding house and then made their way to the saloon. The shorter, stockier one was named Roscoe. He had a thick neck and small, brutish eyes. He did the talking. The other Lyle was tall and thin as a rail, with a watchful reptilian gaze. He rarely spoke, preferring to observe his hand, never far from the butt of the Colt Peacemaker, strapped to his hip. Roscoe laid a freshly minted silver dollar on the bar. "Whiskey," he grunted. "And information." The bartender, a man named Pete, nervously poured the drinks. "What kind of information?" "We're looking for someone," Roscoe said, his voice low. "A woman, young auburn hair. Might have been seen a few weeks back. She'd have been distressed." Pete shook his head. "Ain't seen no one like that. Not many strangers come through here, except folks on the stagecoach, and they don't stick around." Roscoe's eyes narrowed. He slid another dollar across the bar. "Think harder. Our employer, Mr. Duke, is a generous man. He's very eager to find this woman. She's a relative who's run off, prone to hysterics." The mention of Duke's name sent a ripple of unease through the few patrons in the saloon. Even here, in this forgotten corner of the territory, Duke's reputation preceded him. For the next few days, Roscoe and Lyle made their presence known. They asked questions at the general store, at the blacksmiths, at the livery stable. They offered money, and when that didn't work, their questions took on the color of threats. Mrs. Gable, the sharp-eyed woman who ran the general store, took an immediate dislike to them. She was the town's unofficial hub of information, and she gave them none. "A runaway relative?" she sniffed to Sheriff Brodie later that day as he picked up his mail. Nonsense. Those two have the look of wolfhounds on a scent, and the man they work for, Duke, is the wolf. What's he hunting, I wonder? Sheriff Brodie shared her suspicions. He'd sent a telegraph to the marshal in Sacramento, making a quiet inquiry about Bartholomew Duke and any missing persons. He didn't like unaccounted-for trouble in his town. The break came from an unlikely source. A young boy who helped out at the livery stable, eager to earn the silver dollar Lyle had flashed, remembered something. I think I seen her horse," the boy stammered, pointing at the fine black gelding Lyle was riding. "Not his, but one like it. Ridden by that fellow who lives out at Whispering Creek. Cole." Lyle's eyes glinted with interest. "Wyatt Cole, the recluse." "Yeah," the boy said. "He came into town for supplies about 2 weeks ago. Had a different horse with him then, a buckskin. He don't usually switch 'em." It was a tiny detail, almost meaningless. But for a hunter like Lyle, it was a change in pattern, and a change in pattern was a trail. "This Cole fella?" Roscoe asked, joining them. "He live alone. Always has," the boy said. "Ever since his family. Well, ever since." Roscoe and Lyle exchanged a look. A lone man on an isolated ranch. It was the perfect place to hide someone. Their questions now had a new focus. They started asking about Wyatt Cole. They learned of his tragedy, his reclusiveness. The pieces began to fit. A woman disappears from a train in the middle of nowhere. A few days later, a man who never interacts with anyone suddenly appears in town, his behavior slightly altered. It was thin, but it was all they had. Up at the ranch, Wyatt and Josie were living in a fragile bubble of peace. The discovery of the deed had added a new layer of tension, but it had also solidified their bond. They were no longer just a man and a woman thrown together by circumstance. They were allies in a silent war. "I have to go into town," Wyatt announced one morning. "We're low on flour and salt, and I need to get more cartridges." Josie felt a knot of fear tighten in her stomach. "Is it safe?" "Safer for me to go than you," he said grimly. "No one's looking for a grizzled rancher. They're looking for a beautiful woman with auburn hair." He paused, realizing what he'd said. It was the first time he had acknowledged her beauty, and a faint flush rose on his weathered cheeks. Josie felt it too, a warmth that had nothing to do with the morning sun. "Be careful, Wyatt." "Always," he said. His trip to Redemption Peak was unsettling. The moment he walked into Mrs. Gable's store, he felt it. A change in the air. Mrs. Gable pulled him aside, her face etched with worry. "Wyatt, there are 2 men in town," she whispered, pretending to check her inventory. "Asking questions. They work for Bartholomew Duke. They're looking for a young woman." Wyatt's blood ran cold. "What do they look like?" She described Roscoe and Lyle perfectly. "They've been sniffing around for a week. Yesterday they started asking about you." Wyatt's face was grim. "Thank you, Martha." He gathered his supplies, his mind racing. They were close. Too close. As he was loading the sacks onto his horse, Sheriff Brodie approached him. "Cole," the sheriff said, his tone casual, but his eyes sharp. "Haven't seen you for a while. Everything all right out at your place?" "Same as always, Sheriff," Wyatt said, not missing a beat. "Quiet." "Good," Brodie said, stroking his mustache. "I like quiet." He lowered his voice. "Just so you know, I don't care for Mr. Duke's brand of business, and I don't like the look of the dogs he's sent to run his errands. If a man were to find himself in a spot of trouble that wasn't of his own, making the law in this town would be inclined to hear him out. Understand?" It was a cryptic but clear offer of support. Wyatt met the sheriff's gaze and saw an honest man. "I understand, Sheriff, and I appreciate it." Wyatt rode hard on the way back to the ranch, his sense of dread growing with every mile. The bubble had burst. The hunters had found the trail. When he arrived, he didn't even bother to unload the supplies. He strode into the cabin where Josie was waiting, her face anxious. "They're here," he said, his voice stark. "In town. 2 of them. They know about me." Josie's face went pale. The fear she had been holding at bay for weeks came crashing back in full force. "What do we do?" Wyatt pulled the rifle from its scabbard and began checking the action, his movements swift and sure. "You wanted to disappear. Well, the time for disappearing is over." He looked at her, his blue eyes blazing with a fire she had never seen before. Not grief, not loneliness, but pure, cold resolve. "Now," he said, "we fight." The arrival of the hunters shattered the sanctuary of Whispering Creek. The quiet rhythm of their days was replaced by the tense hum of vigilance. Wyatt no longer rode the perimeter. He patrolled it. Josie, who had once feared the pistol, now practiced with it, daily her target a series of tin cans set on a fence post. Her hands grew steady, her aim true. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now tempered with a steely determination. She would not be a victim. She would not be dragged back to Duke. Wyatt taught her the land, not as a rancher, but as a strategist. "See that ridge?" he'd say, pointing to a high crest of rock. "Good for a lookout, but you're silhouetted against the sky. A death trap if they know you're there." He showed her the game trails that offered hidden routes through the thickets, the dry creek beds that could serve as natural trenches. He was teaching her how to survive a siege. Inside the cabin, the deed to the Silver Creek claim lay on the table between them, a silent declaration of war. "He'll come himself sooner or later," Wyatt said one evening, cleaning his rifle by the light of a kerosene lamp. "His men might be able to drag you back, but they can't get this." He tapped the document. "This requires his personal touch. He'll want to look you in the eye when he takes it from you." "Then we should use it," Josie argued, her voice filled with a newfound fire. "We take it to the law, to the territorial marshal. We expose him." Wyatt shook his head. "And say what that a powerful man like Duke is trying to swindle you out of a dusty old claim that no one has worked in 30 years. He has judges and politicians in his pocket. He'd paint you as a hysterical blackmailing runaway. He'd tie it up in court for years, and in the meantime, we'd still be his targets. No. The law is a tool for the patient. We don't have that kind of time." His logic was grimly sound. They were on their own. Their fragile peace was officially broken 3 days later. Wyatt was positioned on a low, brush-covered hill overlooking the main trail to his ranch, a spyglass to his eye. He saw them first as 2 dark specks in the distance, resolving slowly into the figures of Roscoe and Lyle on horseback. They weren't charging in guns blazing. They were cautious, moving, slowly studying the terrain. They were scouting. Wyatt slipped back from the ridge, his movements silent as a cat. He raced back to the cabin. "They're here," he said, his voice low and urgent. "On the south trail, just looking for now." Josie's heart hammered against her ribs. "What do we do?" "We let them look," Wyatt said, his eyes hard. "We give them something to see." He instructed her to stay inside, away from the windows. He then went about his chores, seemingly oblivious. He chopped wood, his axe strokes ringing out in the clear air. He led his horse to the trough for water. He moved with a deliberate slowness, the perfect picture of a man alone and unaware. He was the bait. From their position, a mile away, Roscoe and Lyle watched through their own spyglass. "Just him," Roscoe grunted. doing his chores. Looks like the kid at the livery was wrong. Lyle, ever the more patient of the two, kept watching. Maybe, or maybe he's smart. He knows we're out here. He's putting on a show. He scanned the cabin, the barn, the stark landscape. The place is a fortress, one way in, one way out. High ground on three sides. It'd be a damn fool move to just ride in there. So what's the plan? Roscoe spat, impatient. Mr. Duke is not a patient man. He'll be in Redemption Peak by the end of the week. Then we wait for Mr. Duke, Lyle said coolly. Let him decide how he wants to play this. In the meantime, we'll just keep watch. Make sure no one leaves. For 2 days, a tense standoff ensued. Wyatt and Josie were prisoners in their own home, aware of the unseen eyes that watched their every move. The strain was immense. At night, they took turns sleeping, one always on watch. During one of those long, silent nights, Josie found Wyatt staring at the wooden horse on the mantel. Oh, the lamplight cast deep shadows on his face, making him look older, wearier. "You miss them every day, don't you?" she said softly. It wasn't a question. He didn't look at her, but he nodded. Sometimes I can almost hear Tim laughing, or smell the bread Sarah used to bake. He finally turned to her, his eyes filled with a profound sadness. When they died, a part of me died too, the part that knew how to hope. I locked the rest of it away, Josie. I thought it was safer that way. He reached out his calloused hand, hesitantly touching her cheek. His touch was warm, gentle. Then you showed up, a whirlwind of trouble in a ruined dress, and you made me feel something I hadn't felt in 5 years. "What?" she whispered. "Protective," he said, a faint, sad smile touching his lips. "And terrified, because for the first time I have something to lose again." In that moment, under the silent gaze of the ghosts in the cabin, they weren't a rancher and a runaway. They were just a man and a woman who had found each other in the wreckage of their lives. Josie leaned into his touch, a silent acknowledgement of the unspoken bond that had grown between them. It wasn't a romance born of stolen glances and sweet nothings, but of shared hardship, mutual respect, and the grim understanding that they might die together. The standoff broke on the 3rd day. A rider approached the ranch, not from the South Trail, but openly from the main road. He wasn't Roscoe or Lyle. He was impeccably dressed, riding a magnificent black stallion. Even from a distance, Wyatt recognized the arrogant posture. "It's him," Wyatt said, grabbing his rifle. "Duke!" Bartholomew Duke rode to within 100 yards of the cabin and stopped. He didn't dismount. He simply sat there, a king surveying a lesser domain. Roscoe and Lyle emerged from their hiding places and flanked him, their rifles held ready. "Josephine!" Duke's voice boomed across the clearing, rich and powerful. It was the voice of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "This foolishness has gone on long enough. I am a reasonable man. Come out now, and I will forgive this childish lapse in judgment." Inside the cabin, Josie flinched. The sound of his voice was like a key turning in the lock of a cage. She thought she'd escaped. Wyatt put a steadying hand on her shoulder. "Don't answer," he murmured. "Josephine, do not test my patience," Duke called again. "You are making a formidable enemy of a man who could have been your protector, and you, Cole, I know you're in there. Whatever she has paid you, I will double it. Send her out, and you can return to your miserable, lonely life." Wyatt stepped out onto the porch, his Winchester held loosely at his side. He stood tall, his body language a direct challenge to Duke's authority. "She's not for sale, Duke." Wyatt's voice rang out clear and steady. "And this is my land. You're trespassing. I suggest you and your hired guns turn around and ride away." Duke let out a short, contemptuous laugh. Your land a dusty patch of nothing. You are a relic, Cole. A man clinging to a world that no longer exists. The future is built by men like me, not grubby homesteaders like you." He gestured expansively. "I am the future, and that future includes my wife and my property." Josie, hearing this, felt a surge of cold fury. She grabbed the Silver Creek claim deed from the table, opened the cabin door and stepped out to stand beside Wyatt. She held the deed up for Duke to see. "I am not your wife," she shouted, her voice trembling but strong. "And I believe this is your property." Duke's eyes locked onto the document in her hand. His smile vanished, replaced by a look of stunned disbelief, which quickly hardened into incandescent rage. He finally understood. This wasn't about a runaway bride. It was about the fortune that lay beneath his feet. "So," he said, his voice dropping to a low, venomous hiss. The little mouse had claws after all, and a map to the cheese. He looked from Josie to Wyatt, his face a mask of fury. "This changes things. This is no longer a domestic's matter. This is theft." He turned his horse, slightly addressing his men. "The offer of gold is rescinded, Cole. Now there is only a bounty for your corpse and for the return of what is mine." He spurred his horse, wheeling it around, and rode back the way he came, his henchmen falling in behind him. They disappeared over the rise, leaving a cloud of dust and a heavy, ominous silence in their wake. The negotiation was over. The war had been declared. Wyatt looked at Josie, who was still standing defiant, the deed clutched in her hand. "You realize what you've just done," he said, his voice grim. "Yes," she said, lowering the paper. She looked him straight in the eye. "I do. I've chosen my ground, and I'm not giving it up." Wyatt allowed himself a small, grim smile. "Good," he said. "Because neither am I." The tense quiet that followed Duke's departure was not peace, but the cold breath before a storm. Wyatt knew Duke would not risk a direct assault again. He was a tactician, and he would target their most critical vulnerability. "Our water," Wyatt stated, his voice grim in the barricaded cabin. "It comes from a spring in a box canyon behind the ranch. High walls, one narrow entrance. If he gets control of it, he can starve us out or poison us." Josie, no longer the frightened woman who had fled San Francisco, saw the flaw in Duke's strategy. "A box canyon is a cage, Wyatt," she said, her voice steady. "If they go in, we can make sure they don't come out. It's a trap." Wyatt looked at her, a flicker of grim admiration in his eyes. She was right. They wouldn't wait to be the hunted. They would become the hunters. As darkness fell, their preparations were swift and silent. With Canteen's ammunition and Wyatt's rifle, they abandoned the cabin and slipped into the rugged hills. They moved through the moon-shadowed landscape with a shared purpose, finally taking position in a small alcove hidden by brush high on the canyon wall, overlooking the spring below. From there they waited for the dawn and the violence it would surely bring. The sun rose, turning the canyon into a searing oven. The long, silent hours frayed their nerves, but their resolve held firm. It was nearly noon when they heard the scrape of hooves on rock. Roscoe and Lyle entered the canyon's narrow mouth, leading their horses. They moved with predatory caution, rifles ready. "Place is empty," Roscoe grunted, his voice echoing off the granite walls. Duke was right. They're holed up here, protecting their water. He strode to the clear pool, while Lyle remained near the entrance, watchful. This was their moment. Wyatt rose his Winchester, a seamless extension of his arms. Looking for someone, he called out the challenge, "Clear!" Roscoe spun his face, contorting in surprise, fumbling for his weapon. Wyatt's rifle cracked once. The shot was precise, not meant to kill. It slammed into the rock beside Roscoe's head, peppering his face with sharp granite chips. He screamed, dropping his rifle to claw at his eyes. Lyle reacted instantly, firing his pistol toward the sound. But his shot went wild as Josie from her position opened fire with her own pistol. She didn't aim for him, but for the rock face, above, creating a terrifying storm of ricocheting bullets and dust. The disorienting assault forced Lyle to dive for the cover of a large boulder. It was the opening Wyatt needed. He scrambled down a steep, rubble-strewn slope on the far side of their alcove, his movements swift and silent. Lyle, focused on the gunfire from above, never saw him coming. Wyatt slammed into him from the side, a silent, brutal collision of force. The fight was desperate and brief. Wyatt was fighting for his life, for their lives, and a hard blow to the temple left Lyle unconscious on the dusty ground. The canyon fell silent. Roscoe, stumbling blindly toward the entrance, froze as Josie's voice cut through the air. "Stop," she commanded. He looked up and saw her standing on the ledge, pistol aimed steadily at his chest. The brute's eyes widened in disbelief. "The girl," he stammered. "This girl has a gun." Josie replied, her voice cold as steel. "Drop yours." Before he could comply, another voice joined the standoff, calm and authoritative. "I'd do as she says." Sheriff Brody stood at the canyon entrance, a formidable double-barreled shotgun resting in his arms. He was not alone. 2 deputized men stood with him. "Martha Gable's got a good sense for trouble," Brody said with a nod to Wyatt. "Figured you might need a hand." A wave of relief washed over Josie, so powerful her knees felt weak. But it was short-lived. A figure pushed past the sheriff, his fine clothes covered in dust, his face a mask of incandescent rage. It was Bartholomew Duke. He had followed the lawman, and now he saw the full scope of his humiliation, his hired thugs defeated by a lone rancher, and the very woman he'd come to claim. He ignored everyone else, his burning gaze fixed on Josie. "You," he roared, stalking forward. His hand hovered over the ornate pistol at his hip. "You will give me that deed. It's over," Duke Sheriff Brody warned, leveling his shotgun. But Duke was beyond reason. His empire was built on absolute control, and he had just lost it. "She has my property," he screamed. "No, Mr. Duke," Josie said, her voice ringing with finality. She met his furious glare without flinching. "I have my property." With a defiant flick of her wrist, she tossed the deed. It didn't fly toward Duke, but fluttered out over the water. The old document landed on the surface of the spring, floated for a single pregnant moment, and then sank into the clear depths. Its ink bled into the water, the legal claims and signatures dissolving into nothing. A strangled cry of pure fury escaped Duke's lips. It was the sound of a king watching his kingdom drown. His reason shattered. He ripped his pistol from its holster, but his target wasn't Wyatt or the sheriff. It was Josie. Wyatt moved without thinking, a primal instinct to protect driving him forward. He threw himself at Josie, shoving her hard to the ground, just as the world erupted in the deafening, simultaneous roar of Duke's pistol and Brody's shotgun. The canyon fell silent, the echoes of the gunshots fading into the vast, indifferent sky. Bartholomew Duke lay on the ground, his reign of terror ended by Sheriff Brody's swift justice. Wyatt, his arm bleeding where a bullet had grazed him, was already on his knees beside Josie, his eyes filled with a frantic concern that spoke volumes more than words ever could. She was safe. They were safe. In the aftermath, with Duke's defeated men in custody and the sunken deed resting at the bottom of the spring, the truth of the Silver Creek claim came to light. The threat was gone, but the world had changed. Whispering Creek Ranch was no longer a refuge for a broken man, but the foundation for a new beginning. The ghosts of Wyatt's past didn't vanish, but now they had company. Josie O'Connell, the runaway bride, had stopped running. She had found not just a sanctuary, but a partner. Their shared ordeal had forged a bond stronger than any legal document, a testament to the resilience of the human heart. They had faced down their pasts, and in the rugged heart of the West had earned the right to build a future together on their own terms. If this story of grit, survival, and second chances in the Old West moved you, please give this video a thumbs up. Your support helps us bring more historical dramas to life. Don't forget to share it with someone who loves a tale of redemption, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell. That way, you won't miss our next journey into the heart of the past. Thank you for listening.